welcome back to the Personal Injury Law Show. Before the break, we were talking about the tragic and sad cases of Cornelia Rao and Mrs. Alvarez. Now, Greg, just before the break, you'll tell us a bit about these cases. And there was a substantial payout to Mrs. Rao, but what happened to her? She was a lost citizen, effectively.
She seemed to be someone who was detained, ended up in the detention system, migration detention system, when it was clearly inappropriate that should be the case. She had quite severe mental illness. She was detained for a long period. I think certainly in excess of a year. I think almost
couple of years. I think
almost,
it was
in total, almost 2 years. And
they effectively lost her.
Effectively was lost.
Yeah, she was lost in the system.
It became a non-person.
Yep.
And it was only because of her legal team. She had a very good legal team who forced the government to hold what was the then Howard government to hold an inquiry headed by Mick Palmer.
Yep.
I had the privilege of talking to Mick Palmer, who's a very decent fellow, about this report some time ago, and it was quite revealing just how a culture of a department can allow this to happen. What seems implausible in a democratic country can actually happen to a person. And I think it said a lot about the culture of the Immigration Department that developed under Ruddock, less Amanda Vanstone, but certainly under Philip Ruddock, which was a culture of secrecy, a culture of cover-ups, and a culture of no accountability for people. And you get victims like Cornelia Rao.
Look, just on that note, we should really go to this film clip, viewers, in relation to the Cornelia Rao case. So we'll have a look at that and then have a chat about it, guys.
In the past decade, the government has forked out more than $16 million in compensation to asylum seekers and detainees, and the number is growing. The government paid out about $8 million to 55 detainees and asylum seekers in the past 2 years. And in the 9 years before that, there were 54 compensation cases, including that of Cornelia Rao. It was this case where Australian resident Cornelia Rao was awarded $2.3 million for wrongful detention. It prompted a flurry of offers to 247 people, also considered to have been wrongfully detained. They were active grace payments that did not go to court and did not involve the government admitting liability.
What I do know is every time there's a compensation payout, it is because of a serious breach of duty by public officials who aren't answerable for it.
Viewers, welcome back. As you can see, that clip was quite revealing. What's your take on it, Alice?
It just seems to me, Tony, to be astonishing, because one of the really sad things about Cornelia Rao was that she was actually a permanent resident who got lost in the system, and not only that, she was mentally unwell and she needed care, and no one seemed to be on the job enough to really look after her, and I think it's just terrible.
Is it a case of there being just a small number of detainees and who cares? Is it a who care scenario?
Well, I think there are a lot of misconceptions about the detention system. I think that there's a paranoia in this country and a xenophobia in this country at times, particularly in marginal seats that both sides of politics seek to win at each election. And there's an irrationality that's crept into the debate and which informs public policy. And when you get irrationality informing public policy, whether it's on anti-terror laws or whether it's in relation to detention, you get appalling decision-making, which generally has an impact, a very adverse impact on the most vulnerable people in the community.
Alice, there's a perception out there, and I've taken this up in the past when Greg came on the show, that these detainees are crims.
Look, Tony, I think that following on from what Greg says, there's a real fanning of the flames in terms of the general public feeling towards detainees. A, we don't have a lot of information. B, the information we do have prejudices us against those people coming over. And these are people who have already suffered traumatic experiences before they even get here. And then we place no importance on looking after them or getting them through the system, whatever the result might be. And I think when it comes to something like a state election or a marginal seat, the first thing you do is blame the other. No one is helping this country with its problems regarding xenophobia and racial perceptions. I think it's appalling.
Greg, if you're a crook, why would you risk jumping on a boat that's leaking, inadequately equipped, the engine's no good, the crew don't have experience? Would you do it? Or would you find another way of getting here?
Of course you wouldn't do it. The people who come to Australia who are detainees, in 99% of cases, or certainly 90% of cases, are found to be genuine refugees. That's the first point. The second point is, so we put them through horror and then say, well, actually, you can stay now, almost as though you've...
And then sadly they're on the Centrelink system Social Security system because they're so sick.
Well, they've been mentally and physically traumatised by the system. The second point, though, to make is that there is no queue. This nonsense that there's some orderly queue out there that if you queue up, you'll get your place in the refugee intake that Australia has every year is an absolute nonsense. You know, the global movement of people is a reality. Get used to it, deal with it, and deal with it compassionately.
That's it. And we're so far removed from the rest of the world, so our numbers aren't as great.
And I think too, just on numbers, I think the last set of statistics I looked at showed that proportionally speaking, this country takes the smallest amount of refugees given our particular population. It's pretty appalling when you look, when you line us up against other countries, even such as the US, who take an incredibly large amount of refugees.
Alice, whilst you're talking, tell us a bit about Goldie and the Commonwealth of Australia.
Tony, this case is a little bit different. Brian Goldie was a UK citizen and he was over in Australia in the process of applying for a permanent residency in this country, and he was granted a series of what they call bridging visas, which my very limited understanding is that they give you a visa which allows you to live in the country as opposed to being detained whilst your application is being processed. And for whatever reason, Brian Goldie ended up in a detention centre, I think for a total of 3 days, because someone didn't read the computer system correctly.
So he's a lawful citizen.
That's right. He was a lawful citizen at the time, but he was put in detention because somebody couldn't be bothered double checking.
Okay.
And he brought action against the Commonwealth of Australia for basically being negligent and not being able to read their own documents correctly.
And you got $22,000.
That's right.
Greg, what about Ruddock and Taylor? That's probably the more...
Well, Ruddock and Taylor's a slightly different issue. Mr Taylor was a person who was had committed sex offences, been found guilty. He was then subject to 2 detention arrests under Section 189 of the Migration Act, which give the Minister the power to issue effectively a warrant. And it was done on a false basis. Officers then went out and arrested him. He then sought damages for false imprisonment. The High Court took a view, a very narrow...
He was detained on 3 different occasions.
3 different occasions, and the High Court took a very narrow view of it, which I thought was typical of the conservatism of the High Court at the time, saying that it wasn't the officers who arrested him fault that they relied on false information. Michael Kirby, though, and Michael McHugh had both very, very eloquent dissents saying liberty of the subject is paramount in a democracy,
yes,
and that you should never allow detention when it's illegal.
And it looked at the Section 189 and what you need to consider when making these decisions.
Yeah, it's discretionary, and you just can't go around arresting people simply because you don't like the look of them. That's the way it is in a democracy.
So the answer's on it.
Well, Taylor got $116,000.
That's right.
Viewers, we've got to go to a sponsors break, so please stay tuned. After the break, we're going to come back and talk about the detainees and people smugglers, the effect on children, etc. So please stay tuned. See you soon.